I wanted to study the Day of the Lord with you. This is a follow-up to the video I did on the parousia. While I was doing that video, these thoughts came into my mind. I think it's an appropriate follow-up. The parousia is just a word that means the presence. So whenever you talk about the parousia of Christ, you talk about the presence of Christ. And the Bible never talks about a second coming of Christ, but it does talk about Christ's presence returning. Now, this idea is something that is common throughout the Scriptures. And I want to go through a study of the Day of the Lord with you in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I really am trying to dispel the myth or the idea that we should expect to see Jesus visibly with our eyes sometime in the future coming back to earth while riding on a cloud in order to inflict vengeance on those who do not know God. I don't believe that is a literal image that we should expect to see in the future. So as we study through these scriptures, both Old Testament and New Testament, I hope you can start to develop a new idea of what the Day of the Lord is. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 10 to 21, "Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low, upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, upon all the oaks of Bashan, upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower, and upon every fortified wall, upon all the ships of Tarshish, and upon all the beautiful sloops. The loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, but the idols he shall utterly abolish." This day of the Lord, it brings the terror of the Lord, and it's going to result in the humbling of men. And it talks about bringing down the trees and the hills and things like that. I don't think literally God would say the mountains are too high, we're going to make them shorter. I believe that's also symbolic language, where essentially whenever Jesus or God acts in the day of the Lord, it's going to be such a huge event that the only thing you're going to recognize as having power and authority in this world, anything having any glory or majesty, is completely God and God alone, because only the Lord will be exalted in that day. Verse 19, "They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord." So I underline holes of the rocks and caves of the earth because the things that I underline are also things that are repeated multiple times in association with the day of the Lord in both the New Testament and the Old Testament. So what I'm thinking, and what I hope you can see through these scriptures, is that this day of the Lord is not just one day, it's many different days, and it has many different objects of wrath, and all of these nations or people who are objects of God's wrath experience God's wrath while on earth. It is like a destruction of a city, or a destruction of a nation, or a destruction of certain people on the earth. It is not the end of life on earth as we know it, which is what the New Testament, or that's what people perceive when they read the scriptures in the New Testament alone, without understanding the background or the context of the Old Testament scriptures. "They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. In that day a man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made, each for himself to worship, to the moles and bats, to go into the clefts of the rock, and into the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord. and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. So this is something that's going to happen on earth, and it says the people would want to hide in caves in order to get away from the wrath of God. So this is not a cataclysmic end of time event, miraculous event that ends all life on earth. This is an event that's going to happen on earth, specifically to earthly objects of God's wrath, and people would try to escape God's wrath by hiding in the mountains. Isaiah 13, 1 through 13. The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. Lift up a banner on the high mountain. Raise your voice to them. Wave your hand, that they may enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded my sanctified ones. I have also my mighty ones for my anger, those who rejoice in my exaltation. The noise of the multitude in the mountains, like that of many people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts musters the army for battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, the Lord and his weapons of indignation to destroy the whole land. So this idea of God's army, now it says they come from a far country and also from the end of heaven. So it's possible that God is going to use an earthly army from a distant land in conjunction with his own army to carry out his will. But either way, God's doing it. Whether he's using people to do it or he's doing it with his own army really makes no difference. God is the one responsible for what's about to happen, and it's on the day of the Lord where wrath will be distributed on earth. Verse 6, wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It's imminent. You have that language in the New Testament also. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. So God, the Almighty, is the one who's doing it, and it is destruction. A lot of times people can't fathom the idea that God brings destruction, but certainly the Bible teaches that. God brings destruction. Verse 7, therefore all hands will be limp, every man's heart will melt, and they will be afraid. Pangs and sorrows will take hold of them. They will be in pain as a woman in childbirth. That idea of pain and childbirth is also carried in the New Testament. Maybe I should have underlined it. They will be amazed at one another. Their faces will be like flames. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will halt the arrogance of the proud, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I will make a mortal more rare than fine gold, a man more than a golden wedge of Ophir. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place, in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. So these are events, these are describing events on earth where God carries out his wrath on his objects of wrath on earth. And he may use physical armies to accomplish it, but it's still, even though you don't see God at all, you don't see his hand, you don't see his face, you don't see his army, you simply see other armies or other people that are carrying out God's will, that God uses people and nations to accomplish his will, and that's called the day of the Lord. Isaiah 34, 1-8. Come near, you nations, to hear, and heed, you people. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Also their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down, as the leaf falls from the vine, and the fruit falling from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice for Basra, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and the dust saturated with fatness. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. So this is again describing an earthly battle where God's going to bring destruction, and whether he uses another nation's army to do it, or whether he does it himself, makes no difference. God is the one responsible for it. And it is a destruction on earth of the objects of God's wrath. Jeremiah 46, For this is the day of the Lord God of hosts, a day of vengeance, that he may avenge himself on his adversaries. The sword shall devour, it shall be satiated, and made drunk with their blood. For the Lord God of hosts has a sacrifice in the north country of the river Euphrates. So it's another example of the day of the Lord and the day of vengeance, where God does his will in destroying people. Lamentations 2. Now this is a real long reading, and I'm not going to read it all, but it's the first 22 verses of Lamentations 2, and it's all about the day of the Lord as it relates to Israel itself. So sometimes other nations are the objects of God's wrath, and sometimes the nation of Israel is the object of God's wrath. Verse 1, How the Lord has covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger. He cast down from heaven to the earth the beauty of Israel, and did not remember his footstool in the day of his anger. The Lord has swallowed up and has not pitied all the dwelling places of Jacob. He has thrown down in his wrath the strongholds of the daughter of Judah. He has brought them down to the ground, and has profaned the kingdom and his princes. He has cut off in fierce anger every horn of Israel. He has drawn back his right hand from before the enemy. He has blazed against Jacob like a flaming fire, devouring all around. Standing like an enemy, he has bent his bow. With his right hand like an adversary, he has slain all who were pleasing to his eye. You can see what I underlined here in verse 6. It says, In his burning indignation, he has spurned the king and the priest. The Lord has spurned his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. In verse 9, he says, The law is no more, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. Verse 11, My eyes fail with tears. My heart is troubled. My bile is poured on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. Skipping around to verse 18, it says, Their heart cried out to the Lord, O wall of the daughter of Zion. Let tears run down like a river, day and night. Give yourself no relief. Give your eyes no rest. Verse 19, Arise, cry out in the night. At the beginning of the watches, pour out your heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift your hands toward him for the life of your young children who faint from hunger at the head of every street. Verse 20, See, O Lord, and consider to whom you have done this. Should the woman eat her offspring, the children they have cuddled? Should the priest and prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie on the ground in the streets. My virgins and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered and not pitied. You have invited as to a feast day the terrors that surround me. In the day of the Lord's anger, there was no refuge or survivor. Those whom I have borne and brought up, my enemies have destroyed. So this is a clear picture of God bringing destruction on Jerusalem or the Jews. And it is it's called the day of the Lord's anger, but this is consistent with the use of the day of the Lord also throughout scriptures. This is what happens in the day of the Lord. And it's happened many times throughout history to many different nations and people. That's the context for the day of the Lord. Ezekiel 30, for the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, the time of Gentiles. Joel 1, verse 15 to 20. Alas, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Is not the food cut off before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? The seed shrivels under the clods. Storehouses are in shambles, barns are broken down, for the grain has withered. How the animals groan, the herds of cattle are restless, because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep suffer punishment. O Lord, to you I cry out, for fire has devoured the open pastures, and a flame has burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field also cry out to you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the open pastures. So, this is talking about a day of the Lord where even animals suffer from fire and drought. You recognize in the day of the Lord that God is sovereign and that God's presence is near. It's at hand. Whenever you see God doing magnificent things on earth, that is the parousia of God. It's the presence of God. It is also the day of the Lord's vengeance. Joel chapter 2. Blow the trumpet in Zion. So trumpet is a idea that is mentioned also in the New Testament many times in association with the day of the Lord. And sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. A people come, great and strong, the like of whom have never been, for there will ever be any such after them, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. A fire devours them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds so they run, with a noise like chariots. Over mountaintops they leap, like the noise of flaming fire that devours the stubble, like a strong people set in a battle array. Before them the people writhe in pain. All faces are drained of color. They run like mighty men. They climb the wall like men of war. Everyone marches in formation, and they do not break ranks. They do not push one another. Everyone marches in his own column. Though they lunge between the weapons, they are not cut down. They run to and fro in the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter at the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. The Lord gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great. For strong is the one who executes his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible. Who can endure it? So this idea of the sun and moon going dark and the stars diminish their brightness, most people today seem to think that has to be literally the sun going dark or it could be an eclipse where maybe the moon goes in front of the sun. But it could also be the smoke from a fire of a burning city blocking out the sun. So just don't be narrow-minded in thinking that there's only one way that the sun and moon could go dark and the stars diminish their brightness. It could be from a burning city, or it could be from an eclipse, or it could be just from God turning off the lights, which is, I think, much more unlikely. It's not really the way he has operated in the past. So still in Joel chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, it says, "It shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days. And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the coming and great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." So, is the moon literally going to be blood, or is it going to be what they call a blood red moon, which is an eclipse of the moon? So, but look, this is mentioned in Joel chapter 2. This is also mentioned in the New Testament, I think in Revelation. But people often read the New Testament without any perspective of what has been said in the Old Testament that led the people in the New Testament to say it. So Amos chapter 5. "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, for what good is the day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into the house, leaned his hand on a wall, and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? Is it not very dark, with no brightness in it?" Obadiah 1. "For the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your reprisal shall return upon your own head." So, just carrying with it the consistent idea that the day of the Lord brings destruction, darkness. And it may not be destruction and darkness for everybody. In some cases, it says the day of the Lord is upon all nations. Sometimes it says it's coming for Edom. Sometimes it's for Babylon. Sometimes it's for the Jews. Zephaniah 1. Be silent in the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. For the Lord has prepared a sacrifice, he has invited his guests. And it shall be in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children, and all such as are clothed with foreign apparel. In the same day I will punish all those who leap over the threshold, who fill their masters' houses with violence and deceit. And there shall be on that day, says the Lord, the sound of a mournful cry from the fish gate, a wailing from the second quarter, and a loud crashing from the hills. Wail, you inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the merchant people are cut down, all those who handle money are cut off. And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and punish the men who are settled in complacency, who say in their heart, the Lord will do no good, nor will he do evil. In other words, they're saying God doesn't exist, or they're atheists. Like, God doesn't do good or bad. He just doesn't even exist. Therefore their goods shall become booty, and their houses a desolation. They shall build houses, but not inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards, but not drink their wine. The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There the mighty men shall cry out. The day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. I will bring distress upon men, and they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their flesh like refuse. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by fire of his jealousy, for he will make speedy riddance of all those who dwell in the land. So this is a great destruction, but it's not a global destruction. It's not the destruction of the earth. It's just a destruction of a certain people. Zechariah 14. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. So now we're transitioning into the New Testament. In Acts chapter 2, verse 16 to 21, Peter is the one speaking, and Peter says, "This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." So in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, when the people were seeing multitudes of people speaking in tongues and prophesying. Verse 17, "And it shall come to pass in the last days." So Peter says this is the fulfillment of Joel, and Joel says in the last days. So Peter's saying he was living in the last days. Those people he was talking to were living in the last days. And it's not the last days of life on earth, which is what most people seem to interpret today. It is the last days of the Jewish kingdom, the Jewish religion, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. We've already read this from Joel chapter 2, but I'm actually reading from Acts 2 now. It's a direct quote. I will show wonders in the heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. So Peter says what Joel said back there in Joel chapter 2 is being fulfilled right now before your eyes in the first century on the day of Pentecost. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So this is some of the same ideas I mentioned in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24:29 says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." You see, this was quoted many times in the Old Testament. I've read several examples where it says that. But people read only the New Testament with no perspective of the Old Testament, and they think that Matthew's talking about some new event that has never been talked about before. Matthew is simply using the exact same language that the prophets used, that the Jewish prophets used in the Old Covenant to describe the day of the Lord when God would come to earth, not in a visible form of himself, but his actions would be evident by the destruction that he brought on a city or a nation. So Matthew uses that same language in Matthew 24:29. In Matthew 24:34, he says, "Assuredly," this is Jesus speaking. Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So Peter said that the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 was the fulfillment of the prophet Joel, where he's talking about the last days and the prophecies and the visions, and it was talking about the sun and the moon being dark, and all those things that we talked about. And Matthew records where Jesus said the exact same thing in the first century, that these things that were discussed in Matthew chapter 24 were all going to happen to that generation, before that generation died. And that was the people that were actually seeing and hearing Jesus Christ himself in the first century. So the fulfillment of this day of the Lord in the new covenant, the day of the Lord that Joel prophesied about, and the day of the Lord that Peter said was taking place on the day of Pentecost, Jesus said in Matthew 24 that these things were going to happen to this generation. Now, I know sometimes people want to say, well, generation just means the human race. But that, to me, is ludicrous. He's talking about the people that can hear his voice and see him standing there. He says it's going to happen to you. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 2 to 4. "For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. So I wanted to put a couple of Old Testament scriptures down below to show you that it's using the same language that had been already discussed in the Jewish world. Joel chapter 2, they run to and fro in the city, they run on the wall, they climb into the houses, they enter the house, they enter at the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. So, talks about the day of the Lord in reference to a thief, and the darkness that is referenced here in 1 Thessalonians 5. Joel chapter 1, alas for the day of the Lord is at hand, it shall come as destruction from the Almighty. You see, he says, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them. Isaiah 13:6, well, for the day of the Lord is at hand, it will come as destruction from the Almighty. So the day of the Lord brings destruction. That's that's consistent throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So when you see the day of the Lord in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, but it's true in the Old Testament too, but I think everybody understands the Old Testament references to the day of the Lord are talking about physical destruction on earth. But people, for some reason, think that the mention of the day of the Lord in the New Covenant is talking about the end of life on earth altogether. That's not what the parousia means, and that's not what the day of the Lord is. The day of the Lord is destruction, and the parousia is when God's presence is seen and observed when he brings the destruction on the day of the Lord. 2 Peter 3, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. So let's look at some Old Testament scriptures that use the same language that Peter is drawing from. Zephaniah 1:18, neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath, but the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he will make speedy riddance of all those who dwell in the land. It's the same language. Nahum 1:5, the mountains quake before him, the hills melt, and the earth heaves at his presence, or his parousia. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it. Isaiah 34, all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All the hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as the fruit falling from the fig tree. Revelation 6:12-17. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by the mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it was rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place, and the kings of the earth and great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid himself in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? You see, this is the same language. In fact, it's pulled directly from the Old Covenant language when it uses the phrase, the day of the Lord. It's talking about sudden destruction on earth of a nation or a city or a people. And even here in the book of Revelation, it's talking about the exact same thing. But people have this perspective or perception. People have this perception that whenever the New Testament talks about the day of the Lord, they're talking about the end of life on earth, when that's not ever the case. The Bible does not talk about the end of life on earth. It simply talks about God's presence, his parousia, when he comes on the day of the Lord to inflict vengeance on earth to a specific nation or people. Luke 23:30, this is New Testament. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. So that's just another New Testament example of using the same language of, in the day of the Lord, people will hide in the rocks, and they will say, hide us from God's wrath. Joel chapter 2, the earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. Hosea 10:8, also the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and thistle shall grow on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So when we look at all these scriptures, in both Old Testament and New Testament, you see this repeated language throughout. And the language is clearly talking about an earthly destruction, not planetary destruction, but some kind of bad event that's going to happen to a certain limited number of people on earth, to a specific nation or a city or a group of people. It's not talking about the cataclysmic end of all time. So when you pair this together with the study of parousia, parousia is the presence of God on the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord has happened many times throughout history, and it will continue to happen many times, because God can make his presence known at any point in any time, and he can destroy whoever he wants to destroy for whatever reason he has to destroy them. But that's talking about life on earth. It's not talking about the end of time. So when you study about the day of the Lord, think about his parousia, his presence, and it can come multiple times to different people at different times. He's not restricted for only coming back a second time. He can come back as many times as he wants to. And he in fact, I think he's here all the time. His parousia is always here. He's always present, but just you don't recognize it a lot of times because there's no horrible destruction events taking place. So I don't think it's a very mystical idea. The reason people develop these mystical expectations of Jesus returning on the clouds literally is because they don't understand the context of the language that is used in describing the New Testament day of the Lord, when you should understand the Old Testament descriptions of the day of the Lord to have a better perspective or understanding or expectation for what the New Testament is talking about in the day of the Lord. Jesus himself said that particular things that he mentions in Matthew chapter 24 was going to happen in the first century. And Peter said that what was being observed on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 was the fulfillment of the day of the Lord mentioned in Joel chapter 2. So that completes a brief review of the day of the Lord, a study of the day of the Lord. I hope you will leave a like and a comment. Let me know what you think. And we will continue our Bible studies together. Thank you.